Thank you for being here. This is our talk today, and so we're really glad to say that for Alex Bown will give us a talk and speech without sayables, Epicureans with book language.
Thank you very much. I'm feeling extremely sleepy right now, so please bear with me if I lose my train of thought at some point. No, it's all right. This is still quite full. So I'm a bit of an interloper in that I'm not going to be talking about Stoic ontology. Rather, I'm talking about, I'm not going to be talking about it directly. Rather, my aim today is to investigate how some of their rivals, namely the Epicureans, engage with a key Stoic notion, that of the sayable, as I will render lector. Now, sayables have already been so much discussed today that I don't really need to introduce them much, but just again to remind us the outline. So a sayable on the Stoic view is an incorporeal item that is signified by our utterances. As an incorporeal, it subsists, but does not count as a being. It's central to Stoic logic and philosophy of language, but because their theory is really quite systematic, it plays important roles throughout their philosophical system. Particularly, it comes up quite importantly in their account of causation, and it comes up in their philosophy of mind. And of course, one important kind of sayable is the assertable, as I'm going to be translating axioma, alternatively rendered as assertion or proposition, which is the primary bearer of truth and falsehood and serves as the content of rational impressions. Now, one might well find it surprising that Epicurean philosophers should have said anything about sayables at all. One problem is chronological. The theory of sayables was probably not fully worked out in Epicurus' lifetime, given that the earliest philosopher attested to have used the notion was Cleanthes. Of course, this would not prevent later Epicureans from engaging with the notion. So a more important problem is lack of interest. It is not obvious that there is such a thing as Epicurean philosophy of language. Our sources offer little in the way of a systematic theory. So whereas with Stoic sources, you have a lot of fragmentary texts. You have the clear impression that there's some impressive, well-worked-out theory there that we can't quite get to. With the Epicureans, it's not really like that. It's not obvious that there is any well-worked-out story there in the background. That's because, and when we look at our sources, what we tend to find, when we look at what the Epicureans are reported to have said about this kind of question, we find often rather dismissive remarks. So T1 is a representative example. The Epicureans reject dialectic as redundant, for it is sufficient for natural philosophers to proceed in accordance with the expressions for things. Pruston pragmaton fungus. I imagine that's something like, well, we all know what words mean, so let's just do physics. Who cares about this dialectic? But that being said, Epicurean philosophers do make targeted interventions on specific questions in the philosophy of language that bear on their broader concerns. This is normally with some kind of ulterior motive, and typically coming from physics and ultimately ethics. So one straightforward example, that one of the most well-worked out stories we have from Epicurean philosophy of language is their account of the origin and development of language, which is reported at length both by Lucretius and it appears in Epicurus' letter to Herodotus. Now that plainly is not something that he talks about for its own sake or because he's interested in linguistic questions for their own sake. Rather, it's an important part of his physics because it's part of his account of how the world could have come about without any kind of divine plan or agency. You've got to explain how we can develop language without any teleology in the picture. And so, as I say, that the primary concern there is physics, but then ultimately it's ethics, because even physics for the Epicureans is subordinate to ethics. The point of doing physics is just to attain freedom, freedom from disturbance, mental tranquility. So, this being said, as I say, you might not have expected sayables to be the kind of thing they would talk much about. It's not really obvious how it would bear on their other concerns. That being said, we do have a few reports on which Epicurean philosophers did have something to say about them. I begin with two texts that set out the basic position. It's really quite straightforward. There are none. There are no sayables. just briefly to summarize those texts, I think I'll read most of them, but not all of them. They're parallel discussions in Sextus Empiricus, one in Against the Logicians and one of Outlines of Pyrrhonism. He's doing the same thing in both contexts. He's arguing against the notion of a sign. But specifically, he's dealing with a Stoic account of the sign here, according to which a sign is the antecedent of a certain type of proposition. So a sign turns out to be a kind of sayable. Sorry, is the antecedent of a conditional. So the sign turns out to be a certain kind of sayable. So Sextus's strategy in both texts is the same. It's to say, well, look, there are doubts about the notion of a sayable, because there are doubts about the notion of a sayable, and the sign on your view is a kind of sayable. Therefore, there are doubts about the notion of a sign. I begin with T2. So, moreover, if signs, in their view, have their subsistence in sayables, and whether there are sayables is under investigation, it would be strange to take the species as secure before the genus has been agreed upon. And we see that there are some who have abolished the reality of sayables, hoi anera cotes ten huparxen on lector. And not just those of other persuasions, such as the Epicureans, but even Stoics, such as Basileides, who thought that nothing is incorporeal. So, signs must be preserved in suspension of judgment. In this passage, his strategy is straightforward. Sextus simply observes there's disagreement as to whether there are sayables, and he infers, therefore we must suspend judgment. You might think that's a bit quick. The Epicureans here clearly are introduced together with a renegade Stoic, Basileides, about whom I know nothing apart from this, as those who abolish the reality of sayables. A parallel passage, so the parallel passage T3 from Outlines of Pyrrhonism gives us a slightly more elaborate argument, because here we have a dilemma. And in particular, here he considers the possibility that the Stoics might give some kind of argument for the existence of sayables. I'll read out not the whole thing, but I'll get going. But we say first that it is unclear whether there are any sayables. For since among the dogmatists, the Epicureans say that there are no sayables, whereas the Stoics say that there are, whenever the Stoics say that there are sayables, they employ either mere assertion or also proof. But if assertion, then the Epicureans will set against them the assertion that says that there are no sayables. Whereas if they do make use of a proof, then since proof is composed of assertables, which are sayables, and something composed of sayables cannot be used to give credence to the view that there are sayables, or how will someone who does not grant that there are sayables allow that a compound of sayables, ... I think you get the strategy here. So it's rather straightforward. Either the Stoics simply assert that there are sayables, in which case the Epicurean, we can set against that, the Epicurean claim that there aren't, or they offer an argument, and Sextus proposes to undermine that argument, that proof specifically, by saying that they are in a sense begging the question, because in their view, a proof is itself a type of sayables, so they're presupposing that there are sayables in support of the view that there are sayables. Now, so in both texts, the Epicureans seem to be just serving as standard examples of philosophers who reject the existence of sayables. I should probably not put it quite like that, because of course the Stoics also reject the existence of sayables. The Epicureans say there are no such things as sayables at all. The Stoics will say they don't exist, but they subsist. What these passages don't give us, though, is any clue at all about why the Epicureans should have done that, or what argument they might have given for their view. So even T3, which offers this more elaborate argument in it, it's plainly an ad hominem argument. It's plainly just aiming at undermining the Stoic argument for their view. It's not an argument against the view. So why then should Epicurean philosophers have denied that there are sayables? Well, you might think the answer is really quite obvious. And many commentators have pointed this out in pretty much so many words. There is simply no room for entities like this in Epicurean ontology. So the first part of this paper is going to be trying to show that I think that's a little too quick. I mean, that's quite true, but I don't think it can be the full story. Let me begin by briefly introducing Epicurean ontology, for which I have a few key texts. I'm not really going to read them all out. I also have a schema. What I say now is I hope not going to be particularly controversial, but of course, if any of it is controversial, I'm happy to discuss it later on. So, like the Stoics, the Epicureans are basically materialist or corporealist in their outlook, But also, like the Stoics, there are complications to that basic picture. For the Stoics, the complications come from the category of things that are incorporeal subsistence, and also even further complications from the not somethings. For the Epicureans, the complication comes as follows. So T4, which is from Epicurus' letter to Herodotus, gives us a sort of sensible starting point. Begins, moreover, the totality of things is bodies and void. Face value, that seems straightforward. All and only the things that exist are bodies and void. But actually, it turns out by the end of this passage, but that's not the whole story. Because in the last sentence, he qualifies this by saying, and besides these, nothing can even be thought of, either by apprehending them or by analogy with what is apprehended, as things that are grasped according to complete natures, rather than as what are called the accidents or attributes of these. This gives us, I think, a multi-level ontology. So there's a distinction between two types of being or two types of existence. There are the things that in T4 are described as having complete natures or being grasped according to complete natures. And on the other hand, there are the attributes of those things. In T5, the distinction is drawn in slightly different terms. There, the distinction is drawn as one between what exists in its own right and what exists as an attribute of something that exists in its own right. And indeed, in Epicurus' writing, you find both those types of description and fairly widespread. So we have a two-level ontology. It's not the case that bodies and void are the only things that exist. They're the only things that exist in their own right. And there are these other things, attributes and accidents, which exist in a kind of dependent way. They're parasitic on things of the first class. Now, in T6, which I'm just sort of, it's there, you might want to look at it later, because later in the letters to Herodotus, Epicurus worries quite a lot about, it seems, about how people might misunderstand this view. I just want to sort of point out that in T6, which is some excerpts from his further discussion of accidents and attributes, it emerges that he's quite insistent about some ways in which we shouldn't understand his view. And in particular, we shouldn't understand him as saying that accidents and attributes are separate incorporeal items that exist in their own right. Nor should we regard them as non-existent. He says we should not expel them from being. So he wants to draw some kind of a midpoint between these two extremes. You might think that sort of classically you might associate them with Plato and Democritus. So he neither wants to say that these things exist in their own right as incorporeal items, nor that they don't exist at all in a kind of eliminativist way. Rather, he wants a midpoint. They exist, but in some kind of dependent way. Right, so that's my outline of Epicurean ontology. It should be clear from it, then, why there's no room for sayables in the Epicurean system. It's rather straightforward. There is no distinction in the Epicurean system between being a being and being a something. So on page 4 of the handout, I've given a sort of abbreviated version of a diagram that we've seen again and again today in slightly different versions. So famously, the incorporeals are counted as somethings, but not as beings. And there doesn't seem to be room for such things on the Epicurean view. Presumably, they would say that there's just no difference between being a something and being a being. If you're one, then you're the other. So, simple objection. We won't accept lex out, an Epicurean might say, because they count as subsistent but not existent, and we find that an obscure and indefensible notion. I'm more or less quoting Annas, I think, when I use that phrase. Yes, I mean, that's true, surely, but it's also, I think, leaves some more to be said. In particular, because, of course, everything that I just said applies to all the 4 Stoic incorporeals. Void, place, time, and sayables. But it's only sayables that the Epicureans are said to abolish. So they seem to have a slightly different attitude to sayables from the rest. Now, again, you might think, well, it's obvious why they would do that, because void, time, and place are things that philosophers discussed long before the Epicureans did. They're features that you would expect anyone who's trying to give some kind of account of the natural world to engage with. Whereas sayables seem to be really a theoretical notion introduced for the first time by the Stoics. And so you might well think, therefore, that there's nothing more to this than simply some later Epicurean philosophers saying, we don't understand what this new theoretical notion is. You've made it up. It's not something we need to talk about. I suppose historically that could be a large part of the explanation. But what I'm interested in thinking about now is thinking about whether there might be any kind of deeper philosophical reasons for their rejection than that. So, so my starting point then is to just briefly ask, so what do they do with the other Stoic incorporeals? Because they don't abolish them. They don't say that there are no such things. Well, void and place, very straightforwardly, they treat as one and the same thing under different descriptions. There's a bit of controversy among Epicurean commentators as to exactly how to understand the Epicurean notion of void. But it's pretty clear that Epicurus regards these as one and the same thing. He uses the label anaphers physis, intangible nature, for this thing. And he classes it as something that exists in its own right. So it's, if you like, a kind of exception to Epicurean corporealism. It's an example of thing that exists in the proper sense. It exists in its own right. It has a complete nature, but it's not a body. I think I'm going to talk more, though, about their treatment of time, because I think that might be more interesting for our current purposes. So time, what they do with it is they class it as an accident of accidents. We have a couple of texts which, in which come from Sextus Empiricus as against the physicists. So he's discussing he's engaged in discussing here in sequence a number of notions in physics and trying to show in each case that no one has got it right, or we should suspend judgment of what the various people who've done physics have said on these questions. Here he's dealing with time. So in T8, he introduces the Stoic position after having just discussed Anisidimith. So these people make time a body, whereas the philosophers from the Stoa thought that it was incorporeal. For some things, they say that some are bodies and others incorporeal. And they enumerate 4 kinds of incorporeal: sayable, void, place, and time. From this, it is clear that they take time to be incorporeal, and moreover that they reckon that it is a kind of thought of in its own right thing, which is, I'm not really sure how to translate it, so that's kathauto te noumenon plagma. I think, as Mashiakingas Bronosky remarks about this passage, this looks to me as if it's a case in which, whereas often when we get Sextus reporting Epicurean positions, he uses vocabulary that comes from the Stoics. Here it might be the case that he's reporting the Stoic position with vocabulary that derives from the Epicureans. In particular, this notion of the kathauto, what is in its own right. In T9, which immediately follows T8, he then moves on to Epicurus's position, as reported by Demetrius Lacon. So we have other texts which confirm that this is accurate. But Epicurus, as Demetrius Lacon describes him, says that time is an accident of accidents, attending days and nights and hours and affections, and non-affections and movements and rests. For all these are accidents of certain things, and time, given that it accompanies all of them, would reasonably be called an accident of accidents. I've then cut out there are then a further few sections in which actually the first one was T5. So he then gives an outline of Epicurean ontology, then he explains why days and nights and hours and so on count as accidents, and then he sums up, which is now this final paragraph. Well then, it is clear from this that Epicurus thinks that time exists as something incorporeal, but not in the same way as the Stoics. For they, as has been said, set down time as something incorporeal that is thought of in its own right, whereas Epicurus regards it as an attribute of certain things. So he's pretty clear. According to Sextus, actually, they both agree that time is incorporeal. It's just a question of where we put it in our ontology. Both philosophers have 2-tier ontologies with kind of a privileged notion of... So there's a notion of being there that's privileged with respect to the other notion. For the Stoics, the notion of being there that's privileged is the notion of being a being, and the other notion is the notion of subsistence. For the Epicureans, it's being existing in your own right versus being an attribute. Their treatment, Sextus says, is just parallel in that the Epicureans put time, they regard it as an incorporeal, and then put it in their inferior tier, just as the Stoics do. Some of this, I think, is a bit tendentious. It's unlike, I doubt that Epicurus himself would actually want to say that time is an incorporeal. Indeed, in the letter to Herodotus, he talks a bit about what he means by the expression incorporeal. This is E10. One must additionally bear in mind that the word incorporeal is said according to the commonest usage of the world, as applying to what can be thought of as being in its own right. And one cannot think of anything incorporeal being in its own right except void, but void can neither act nor be acted upon, but only allows bodies to move through it. This is part of his argument for why the soul can't count as incorporeal, because the soul does that. So it looks as if Epicurus thinks that strictly speaking, the only things for which you should use the expression incorporeal are things that exist in their own right. The case of time, therefore, is probably neither incorporeal nor a body. It's an attribute of a body. I'm not entirely sure. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought temporarily. Yeah, so I mean, that is a sense in which I think Sextus is perhaps oversimplifying the comparison between the two views. It seems that, I think that Epicurus' use of the word incorporeal here could probably be defended because he probably thinks of attributes as essentially attribute. And what an attribute is it's parasitic on the body it belongs to. And therefore it doesn't really make good sense to say that it is asomatos, i.e. without body or bodiless. It looks like asomatos and soma are picking out polar opposites rather than asomatos merely meaning not a body. So, the upshot then is that the only Stoic incorporeal, as I say, that the Epicureans seem to abolish is the sayable. With all the other ones, their attitude is quite different. Their attitude is rather to say that, well, of course, would it presumably be to say, well, of course, this thing, as characterized by the Stoics, isn't there. But the Stoics are trying to talk about something that we too are trying to talk about it, and this is the right way to understand it. At face value with the sayable, it seems that their attitude is different. They don't say, they're trying to talk about something and have slightly got it wrong. They're saying, well, they're fantasists. They've invented something that isn't there at all. We don't have any alternative story to give. So that's, in a sense, now this is really the question I want to start to address in this paper. Why? And to do that, I'm sort of going to take these three questions here as the lead. So question one, what roles do sayables play in the Stoic system? What theoretical problems are they intended to solve? It's not that I'm going to be able to answer that question in its entirety. Question two, do the Epicureans A, have an alternative account of what kind of entity plays these roles? Or B, do they deny that anything plays these roles? Or C, do they not have any interest in relevant theoretical problems? Would they, as in T1, say, we don't need to worry about that kind of thing? And then question three, because sayables play many roles, I think question three is also important. So something key to the notion of the lecton is that it's this one type of thing that plays all these roles across the system. So if the Epicureans do recognize the need for entities to play at least some of the roles played by sayables, do they think it's the same kind of thing that plays all these roles, or the different kinds of thing play different roles? And I think answering these questions will kind of shed a bit of light on what we should make of their rejection of the sayable. And in particular, for example, if I were to try to argue that the answer to question 2 is A, and also the answer to question 3 is A, then so that they do have alternative accounts of what plays these roles, and it is the same thing playing all these roles, then I think one would have to say that the abolition of sayables is really just an abolition in name only. They don't like the words lecton, but they have something that's playing exactly the same theoretical roles. Conversely, if there are some roles that they don't think are played by anything, or that they don't think that there is this one key thing that plays all these roles, it looks as if there might be more philosophical substance to the disagreement here. They don't think that, they think that on this view, they would be thinking that in talking about the lecton, the Stoics haven't really succeeded in talking about anything there at all that does play all these theoretical roles. So my plan then for the rest of the paper is to try to discuss a number of roles. I've got 3 on the handout. I may or may not get through all of them, and I'm going to have to be quite superficial in a lot of them. And I hope that what I say about the Stoics is going to be uncontroversial, though I'm sure you'll tell me if it isn't. What I say about the Epicureans will probably be quite controversial, but I'm prepared to defend it. So I'm aiming to try to talk about three cases. So one to do with metaphysics, causation, the next one to do with logic, bearers of truth and falsehood, and a third one to do with psychology, because certain types of sayable is said to serve something like as the content of rational impression. Begin with causation. Causation, where hopefully we get actually a nice straightforward contrast drawn by Sextus between the views of the Epicureans and the Stoics. This is T11. So it's again against the physicists. Again, he is trying. This is in fact the beginning of an extended argument he's going to give. He's giving, in a sense, the program for the way in which he's going to argue that that we must suspend judgment about causes. So it runs as follows. So moreover, if there are any causes, then either one, a body is a cause of a body, or two, an incorporeal is a cause of an incorporeal, or three, a body is a cause of an incorporeal, or four, an incorporeal of a body. But it is neither the case, one, that a body is a cause of a body, as we will show, nor two, an incorporeal of an incorporeal, nor three, a body of an incorporeal, nor four, in reverse, an incorporeal of a body. So there are no causes. Of course, here he's giving the program for the argument he's going to give later on. But then he comments that the division he's come up with is not random. It's not arbitrary. Of course, the positions that have come about among the dogmatists agree with the division just presented. If, at any rate, and now I'm using the same numbering so that we can keep track of it, so 3, the Stoics say that every cause is a body that becomes a cause of something incorporeal for a body. For example, a knife, a body, is a cause for flesh, a body, of being cut, an incorporeal predicate. And again, fire, a body, is a cause for wood, a body, of burning, an incorporeal predicate. And 4, those who suppose that the God who creates the world and governs everything is incorporeal say the opposite, that it is something incorporeal that is the cause of body. And now this covers both positions 1 and positions 2. Epicurus says that both bodies happen to be causes of bodies and incorporeals of incorporeals. Bodies of bodies as elements of compounds, and incorporeals of incorporeals as the incorporeal attributes of the first bodies are causes of the incorporeal attributes of the compounds. Now, one difficulty with this passage is that Sextus is not actually giving complete reports of a Stoic analysis of causation here or an Epicurean analysis of causation. All he's saying is something about the kinds of entities that are involved. Luckily for the Stoics, we do have other evidence that fills out the picture a bit more. So in particular, there's a key passage from Stoius, which explains that the cause is of that because of which, and that on the Stoic view, it's impossible for a cause to be present without what it causes obtaining. Causes necessitate their effects. Unfortunately, however, as far as I'm aware, we don't have any parallel reports of the Epicurean view. We don't have any hints of a more fleshed out Epicurean analysis of causation. We just have this, which just says what things are involved in it. Still, however, the specific examples given here do seem to capture certain types of explanation that are very often found in Epicurean texts. I mean, explanation, though, one would think, I'm translating Aition as cause systematically here, but I think that normally in philosophical talk today, one would prefer to label this explanation rather than causation. So Epicurus himself describes atoms as the principles of compound bodies, and that seems to correspond closely to bodies being causes of bodies, the elements being causes of compounds here. And there are many examples of an Epicurean explaining the attributes of some body by reference to the attributes of its atomic parts. Mention a few. Honey is sweet because it contains smooth atoms. Diamond is hard because its atoms are hooked and tightly packed. Epicurean texts, such as the letters to Lucretius, the various letters by Epicurus and Lucretius, are full of such examples. So as I say, I think this, at face value, those examples seem to be more like a case of metaphysical explanation than one of causation more narrowly. It's a bit unclear to me whether it's just he's happened to have chosen these particular examples, or whether this claim, bodies are causes of bodies, attributes are causes of attributes, is supposed to apply to all cases of causation. I've sort of raised a few doubts here. It's a little unclear to me how much we can take from this account of the Epicurean views on causation. Still, though, I don't think we should necessarily doubt it. It seems to me to be fair to what kinds of causal explanatory claim we actually do find in Epicurean texts. So I will raise then question 2. Is it the case that something on the Epicurean account plays the role played by sayables on the Stoic account with respect to causation? Well, we might at first think that the answer is yes, because both think that there's something that gets caused in an episode in causation. That's the role. What gets caused? For the Stoics, it's electron. The Epicureans, it's either a body or it's an attribute. So there's already a bit of a difference there because it's not one type of thing. But actually, on further thought, that probably mischaracterizes the comparison between the two. Because actually, on further thought, it looks as if the two theoretical frameworks seem fundamentally incompatible. Because these Stoics seem to be analyzing causation as a three-place relation, but the Epicureans seem to be analyzing causation as a two-place relation. It doesn't really seem correct to say that, well, when they talk of bodies as causing bodies, one should map the second occurrence of body onto Stoic lector, or onto the body that's in the body for which the lecton occurs on the Stoic side. Rather, here it really looks as if we have incompatible approaches. So I'm inclined to think that in this case, my answer to question 2 would be, I'm tentatively inclined towards B, which is to say that, so they clearly do have a theoretical interest in causation. It's not something they don't care to talk about, but it doesn't look as if the account they give has a role for something that is just straightforwardly analogous to the role that lector play on the Stoic theory. Right, I'm going to, so I have 10 to 15 minutes left, right? Okay. Well, so the second topic I go on to now is more logical. So primary bearers of truth and falsehood. So here again, we have a key passage. It's a passage that has been much discussed. I will read out the entire thing, although in the end, I'm only going to talk about parts of it. So this comes from early in book 2 of Against the Logicians. Sextus is currently engaged in discussing notions of truth. He's already discussed a first disagreement among the philosophers about truth. And specifically, that disagreement is about what kinds of thing are true or false. Now, he introduces a second disagreement as follows. So the first disagreement about the true was along these lines, but there was also another dispute among them. According to this dispute, some of them, these philosophers he's been talking about, laid down the true and the false in the domain of what is signified, others in that of sound, and others in that of the movement of thought. Well, the first opponent was supported by the Stoics, who said that there were three things connected to one another: what is signified, what signifies, and the item in question, to tunkanon. Of these, the sound is what signifies, such as dion. What is signified is the very thing that it reveals, and which we grasp as it subsists in our thought, while foreigners do not understand it, though they hear the sound. And the item in question is what underlies externally, such as Dion himself. And of these, two are bodies, the sound and the item in question, and one incorporeal, a signified thing, which is sayable and turns out to be true or false. And this is not so in all cases. Rather, some of these are incomplete and others complete. And belonging to the complete kind is the so-called assertable, about which they say, giving an outline account, an assertable is what is true or false. But Epicurus, and straight up the natural philosopher, allow only two of these, what signifies and the item in question. So they appear to hold the second position and to leave the true and the false in the domain of sound. For the final opinion, I mean the one according to which the true is laid down in the movement of thought, seems to be scholarly fiction. Now, obviously, this is an extremely controversial and much discussed passage in many contexts. So in particular, this is especially important as evidence for the Stoic view of about lector. It's also obviously very problematic. The example that Sextus gives seems quite unhelpful because it's deeply controversial as to whether an utterance of Dion signifies electron. And even if it does signify electron, it's clearly not one that's going to be true or false. I'm not going to talk any more about that. I'm going to try to concentrate on the Epicurean side. So, the first off, I think it's just worth sort of being clear. So what is this about? What's this disagreement about, the second disagreement? It's introduced as a disagreement about where the true and the false are to be laid down, where they lay them down. Hupester santo. Now, you might think that this is therefore just a disagreement about what kinds of things are true or false. Is it sounds that are true or false? Is it things signified that are true or false? Is it movements of thought that are true or false? ... But it can't be that. First, partly because the previous disagreement in Against the Logicians was precisely a disagreement about what kinds of things are true or false. And Sextus seems to be saying this is a different type of disagreement. And also because it's in any case not true that the Stoics say that the only thing that is true or false is electron. Rather, it's oddly assertable. It's the only thing that's true or false in its own right. Other things can be said to be true or false derivatively. Specifically, mental states of certain types can be said to be true or false by reference to the assertable that is their content. So T13, which is in fact the passage that immediately precedes T12 in Against the Logicians, makes this clear. And in particular, you notice the distinction between whether things are true directly, ex eutheos, and whether they are true by reference to something else, katanaphoran, to something else. So this isn't therefore this disagreement, therefore, I think is not about what kinds of things are true or false. It's where are truth and falsehood fundamentally located? What are the primary bearers of truth and falsehood? The idea is that we've got to specify one kind of entity that counts as true or false in a primary sense, and the other things that bear truth values do so by reference to that primary thing. Sextus infers, so what should we make of this disagreement then? Well, at first sight, as I say here, this looks similar to the case of causation because three roles are there to be played on the Stoic theory: signifier, signified, and totunkanon, the item in question, but supposedly only two on the Epicurean view, the signifier, the item in question. But matters may not be so straightforward as that, as many commentators have pointed out. There's been quite a lot of debate among Epicurean commentators about this passage, and in particular what they tend to focus on is questions about whether the Epicureans think that there is some kind of intermediate item that serves as something like the meaning of general terms. So in particular, and one influential line of scholarship, so Long, Sedley, Everson, think that on the Epicurean view, a preconception, a mental item, plays the role of something like the meaning of words. But there are also people who've disagreed vehemently like that. The evidence for that comes from early in the literature of Herodotus and also from from Diogenes Laertius' summary of Epicurus' canon, where prolepses seem to be described as those things that underlie ta hypothetically expressions. I myself am inclined to be a bit skeptical about that, partly because I think that those two passages are really dealing with epistemological concerns rather than semantic concerns, because there I think what he's setting out is guidance for inquiry rather than a semantic theory. But at any rate, I don't particularly intend to talk about that now, because rather what I'd like to focus on is what people haven't focused on so much, which is not the case of general terms. It's the case of what supposedly this disagreement is actually about, namely bearers of truth and falsehood. So I'm going to be interested in, say, declarative sentences and what they signify and totunkanon. So I have to say it's not clear to me, even here actually I would like help from those who are experts on Stoicism. It's not totally clear to me what, on the Stoic view, the difference totunkanon is in the case of the declarative sentence. I see that you utter a declarative sentence, you signify an axioma. It's not clear to me what the totunkanon is as distinct from that. You might think that it's something like a state of affairs, but then people who write on Stoicism often refer to axiomata as states of affairs. At any rate, what I'm interested in is, well, what is the Epicurean view on this question? So Sextus says that they think that faunae play this role, sounds play this role. Now that's actually a very strange view, I think. So the view is not faunae are the only things that are true or false. The view is utterances are the primary bearers of truth and falsehood. Other things are true and false, but derivatively by reference to sounds. Now, the Epicureans speak pervasively of mental states as true or false. Doxai, judgments or opinions on the one hand, and aistheses, perceptions on the other. So presumably, on the view Sextus ascribes to them, they would be committed to the view that a perception is true by reference to some utterance. But what utterance, I'm inclined to ask? I mean, one can perfectly well perceive things without saying anything at all. I find that really quite unlikely as a view that they should have had. And of course, as many people have pointed out, it's not that Sextus himself presents this as an inference. He doesn't say, he presents this, he writes, they appear to hold the second position. And he infers this from the fact that, in his view, they deny the existence of the lecton. There's an obvious problem with that inference, as many people have pointed out, because he himself has provided 3 alternative positions in the first instance. So the third position, according to which the true is laid down in the movement of thought, is left as a live option. That, I think, is actually already more promising than Fornai or Epicureans. Curiously, he refers to it here as a scholarly fiction, even though he engages with it later in Against the Logicians, as if some people actually hold it. So that's one alternative candidate. Maybe they think mental states are the primary bearers of truth and falsehood. I'm thinking movement of thought is some kind of vague description of mental states. I'm inclined to think, though, that actually that's not the answer. I think there's another candidate, and here I need to beg your indulgence a bit because I'm going to be trying to appeal to work I've already done, and which is deeply controversial, but which I'm not really going to be able to argue for full here. So I look forward to your questions. So my alternative candidate is perceptibles and judgeables, the objects of perception and the objects of thought. And this is motivated by a number of observations. So first, as many commentators have noticed, you find widespread in Epicurean writing an association between truth and existence. They quite often use quite often find texts in which something is said to be true and to exist as if two were more or less interchangeable. T14 is an example of that. Now, T14 comes only shortly before this relevant passage, T12. So T14 is the Epicurean entry in the previous disagreement, the disagreement about what kinds of things are true or false. So I read it out. And Epicurus spoke of all perceptibles as true and as beings, for it made no difference to say that something is true or that it exists. After that, he also gave an outline of truth and falsehood. True, he says, is that which is it is said to be, and false, he says, is that which is not as it is said to be. And he says that perception, being able to apprehend the things which are subjected to it, and neither subtracting nor adding nor changing anything, because it is non-rational, both in all cases tells the truth and grasps that which is, just as that very thing is by its nature. But he says that while all perceptibles are true, judgeables are different, in that some of them are true and others false, as we showed earlier. So this passage has a number of serious difficulties with it, which, as I say, I previously tried to solve. So just to give sort of an idea of what I argue for, so one first question is, what are perceptibles and judgeables here? Now, Sextus does sometimes use perceptible and judgeable as an alternative name for mental states, i.e. perceptions and judgments. But here it seems to be much more natural to take perceptible as the object of perception, the thing perceived. Because he described, we're told that perceptibles are both true and are beings. They are things that exist. And I'm inclined to think that we should take that seriously. And moreover, the particular definition that's given in sentence 2 of the passage, this outline of truth and falsehood, is itself really quite mysterious and difficult to make sense of. You might look at it at first and think, well, that just seems another variation of Aristotle's definition of truth and falsehood, according to which to say what is as it is true, to say what is not as it is not is false. That's not quite right, but on the right lines. But in fact, this definition gets it the other way around. So this one does not say that the thing it's the statement that's true. This definition, curiously, seems to be ascribing truth values to the things about which you speak. True is that which is as it is said to be. Not true is saying something to be as it is. So that's just giving you a sort of taste of my where I started from in arguing. So, but now sort of to fast forward to the view I ascribe of it. So I'm inclined to think that in order to make sense of this and other texts, we should think that the Epicureans employ two notions of truth. One is a kind of ontological notion. It's very closely associated with existence, and it applies to complex items of a certain type. They're analogous to what other theoreticians might call states of affairs. I'm inclined to think they're more like predicative complexes. We find an example in Lucretius of kidnapped Helen as something that counts as an accident of certain bodies. So I think that those things are the things that are called true or false in this context. And moreover, that they are the primary bearers of truth and falsehood on the Epicurean view. And evidence for that comes from T15, a very fragmentary passage from a work by Demetrius Lakon, which deals with basically trying to explain bits of Epicurean writing. It's some kind of exegetical work. And in there, it really seems quite clear that there is a distinction to be made between perceptions and perceptibles, and that the truth of perceptions is defined by reference to that of perceptibles. The passage is sufficiently fragmentary that it's really quite hard to make sense of it. But just to read out at least the first paragraph, it looks as if we're dealing with sort of an objection and then a partial response and then the beginning of another objection. So when it is inquired how we say that perceptions are true by reference to the perceptibles, katanaphoran, the answer is, well, for insofar as the latter are true. Yet a difficulty seems to occur. Then we have no text for a page. But then, luckily, they still seem to be talking about the same thing a page later, and we seem to be getting part of the explanation. And it's by reference to the perceptibles we say this, not because the perceptibles are said to be true, but rather by reference to the things synonymous with these, for it is insofar as they exist. My impression is that probably what's going on here is that the objection was something like, well, you're just confused insofar as you are calling both perceptions and perceptibles true, or it just doesn't follow from, if you have two notions of truth, then it doesn't follow from perceptibles being true that perceptions are true. And I'm inclined to think that their response here is to say, well, it isn't because they're said to be true. It's not, we're not relying on this similarity of word. Rather, it's because of what we mean by that. And what we mean by that is roughly because they exist. So in a sense, they're appealing to an ontological notion of truth. So as I say, I apologize because, I mean, that really is a paper in its own, and it's really quite controversial. But I think my upshot for that is that the result of that is that I actually think that despite appearances, there is something that on the Epicurean view plays a role when it comes to being a primary bearer of truth and falsehood that is analogous to the Stoic axiom, the Stoic assertible. That is to say that things like mental states, perceptions and beliefs that are said to be true or false, but they're not what are fundamentally true or false. There is something more fundamental, something in virtue of which they count as true or false. And that's an item out there in the world. The Epicureans class it as an accident. The Stoics class it as an incorporeal lecton. There are some differences, so the match isn't perfect. In particular, one straightforward difference is that it's clear that the axioma is there even when it's false. Whereas the fact that the Epicureans associate this notion of truth with the notion of existence makes it rather hard to see what they would say about cases of falsehood. And they might run into the kinds of problems that Plato tries to solve in the Sophists, say. But still, I think here, the theory is actually, there is, in a sense, here my answer to question 2 would be to A, which is to say that I think that there probably is something there on the Epicurean view, something a bit like a state of affairs that plays a role analogous to the axioma on the Stoic view, specifically when it comes to being a primary bearer of truth and falsehood. So I'm kind of, I won't therefore, I mean, so my third topic, I will not try to do in the book. Well, I will, but I've been talking for how long?
Well, you have been talking for 45, 50 minutes. But you still have 10 if you want to leave half an hour for this.
Okay. All right. Well, then I will try to be quick. So my third context in which I talk about the roles of sayables is now in the realm of psychology. And in particular, so sayables on the Stoic view, I want to say, seem to play one important role, and one important role when it comes to explaining rationality. So, lead with a couple of classic texts. T16, the Stoics maintained that the true and the false are in general in the sayable. And they say that a sayable is what subsists in accordance with a rational impression, and that a rational impression is one in which what appears can be exhibited in language. T17, moreover, some impressions are rational and others non-rational. This is after a series of divisions of impression. Rational are those of the rational animals, and non-rational those of the non-rational. So rational impressions are thoughts, whereas non-rational impressions do not a name. So, two striking features, which I hope are relatively uncontroversial. Perhaps people will correct me. I think this is sort of something I think Ricardo said in his influential paper on this. There seem to be two striking features of this. One is that, on the one hand, what makes an impression rational is that its content can be linguistically articulated. It can be exhibited in language, as T16 says. And what that seems to amount to is having a sayable as its content. It has a sayable, specifically an axioma, that subsists in accordance with it. So non-rational impressions don't have sayables subsisting in accordance with them. And the other striking feature of the account, coming from T17, is that it seems that, well, if you just read T17 at face value, it looks as if you're rational, then you're rational through and through. So if you have the rational impressions are those of the rational animals, the non-rational impressions are those of the non-rational animals. You can't have some rational impressions and non-rational impressions. It's all or nothing. So I think this then is, sort of roughly amounts to a third distinctive role of sayables. So in psychology, it's making a clear difference between rational and non-rational mental states, and also rational and non-rational beings. So one straightforward consequence, of course, of this is that although, say, non-rational animals and children have plenty of impressions, they have perceptual impressions, those perceptual impressions can't be said to have lectors' content, and therefore, presumably, cannot, strictly speaking, be said to be true or false. I know, there's quite a debate on whether they are representational at all, and quite a few people have argued that there is some thinner notion of representation that might apply in this case. At any rate, so what about the Epicureans? What would they say about this role of sayables? Well, here we don't have, as in the previous cases, a straightforward text that draws a contrast. But still, I think it's not difficult to see that they would not be at all sympathetic to either of these claims. Again, so it is the case that on the Epicurean theory, a distinction between rational and non-rational states plays a very important role. It plays a very important role in their epistemology, because in their view, perception is non-rational, doxa is, judgment is rational, and that's in part why, that is why, not just in part why, that is why, perception can be completely relied upon, why it's always true. So this distinction does play a key role in their theory, but firstly, they don't think that if you're rational, then you're rational through and through, since they think that any of us has plenty of perceptual states and also plenty of doxastic states. And the former are non-rational and the latter are rational. So two is simply false in their view. But what's I think more interesting is that my impression is that I also doubt that they would favor one. And this is a bit more controversial. And here I think, for example, I'm disagreeing with something Simon argued recently with Whitney Schwab. But my inclination is to suspect that the rational and rational distinction between these states is not to be drawn in quite the same way as the Stoics do it. And in particular, I doubt that it's drawn in a content way. So it seems that what's crucial on the Stoic view is that these different types of states have different types of content, and they're perhaps structured in different types of ways. Now, we don't have much Epicurean, in the way of an Epicurean description of what the content of impressions is like. The closest we come are their stories of how these states are caused, particularly their story of visual perception and their story of thought. And what's quite striking is that the two stories are parallel. You don't find sharp contrast drawn between them. So I'm not going to read it out, but that's T20 is Epicurus' version of this. So T20 is where Epicurus explains both vision and thought. he does it at one at the same time. In both cases, it relies on the reception of images from the outside. You might think that in the case of Philip, this is rather quite far-fetched. But at any rate, I just simply want to draw attention to this, is that they systematically seem to favor imagistic accounts of both phenomena, both perception and thought. You don't find, I think, a straightforward contrast between the two. So what is important to the rational and non-rational distinction? Well, I'm inclined to think that it's not. So we have a couple of texts in which appeal to that distinction is made. One was back to T14. T14, sentence 3. And he says that perception being able to apprehend the things which are subjected to it, and neither subtracting nor adding nor changing anything, because it is non-rational, both in all cases tells the truth and grasps that which is, just as that very thing is by its nature. And then T19, a parallel report from Diogenes Laertius. For Epicurus says, all perception is non-rational and not receptive of any memory, which is neither moved by itself nor when moved by something else, capable of adding or subtracting anything. So here it seems to me that what is doing the work in introducing this notion of non-rationality and using it to support the view that perception tells the truth is that the faculty of perception is unable to alter. It is purely passive. It's purely automatic. It just takes an input and gives an output. It can't meddle with it. And therefore, my hypothesis is that maybe that's actually what's central to the rational, non-rational description for the Epicureans. It's not whether you have a certain type of, say, synthetic structure or a certain type of content. It's whether you have a certain type of agency or freedom. A rational faculty is one that can respond in more than one way or can modify or in some way, other way, alter what it gets affected by. The non-rational state can't. So therefore, I'm inclined to conclude that there just is no, that here, now there is, again, so the Epicureans clearly have a theoretical interest in the difference between rationality and non-rationality. It's very important for their system. But it's not the case that anything like the lecton plays the role of making that distinction. It's not a content-based distinction at all or a structural distinction at all. It's a distinction to do with whether, on the one hand, a given faculty operates in an automatic, passive way, or whether, on the other hand, it's free to respond in more than one. So, in short, just to sum up, where are we? Well, it's a very mixed bag. So I've answered, for one role, I've answered that they do have something that's roughly a parallel to the axioma, namely primary bearers of truth and falsehood. In the other two cases, I've answered that they don't. So in short, I'm inclined to conclude then that there is something more to their rejection of sayables than merely the fact that sayables are metaphysically objectionable entities in their view. It is deeper than that. It's that they think that other things do the kind of theoretical work and things that just aren't analogous to lector in any people. Sorry to have gone over by quite a long way. Hope you're not too tired. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask you about the causation business. So in general, let me just start by saying I'm very sympathetic and inclined to agree with your assessment of this. But I'm very curious how you're inclined to understand this rather difficult report that we get here. So the stoicheia are causes of the compounds, and the symbibicota of the stoicheia presumably are causes of the symbibicota of the compounds.
Yeah.
Corporeal and incorporeal, great. Now, would you care to speculate about what more we could say? For instance, I mean, it seems tempting to say that that in a more fleshed out story, there would be some kind of interaction between these two.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, in the sense, and this is why, in the sense, I sort of think the contrast here is not very helpful in that it really seems as if they're operating with a different notion. I mean, I'm inclined to think that it's not really causation, it's explanation. So it's not really I mean, it depends what you mean by interaction, but not in the...
What I had in mind was something like, one might wonder if the way in which the elements are causes of the compounds has something to do with the relationship between the accidents in the two cases. given the relationship between the accidents for the compound and what the compound is.
Right. Yeah, so you might think, so okay, so are you sort of suggesting that the sense in which accidents at the lower level are causes of accidents at the higher level is in some sense subsidiary to or dependent on the sense in which atoms cause the existence of compounds? Is that the idea?
And perhaps also the other way around.
Why the other way around?
Well, you might think so if you thought that the way in which the elements are causes of a compound is in part by way of the relationship between the accidents of the elements and the compound or accidents of the compounds, by reference to which the compounds are the very compounds they are.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean. So in a sense, it's not like with the diamond case, for example. It really seems fundamental to the diamond that it's something hard rather than soft. And that could be partly what explains why these particular atoms are.
Typically, this is not a sort of hidden objection. It's just a...
No, I mean, I think that's promising. I suspect that seems promising. I mean, insofar as we get a more fleshed out story of any of it. So on the attribute side, of course, it's always just they say that there are certain phenomenal attributes of the higher order body to be explained by various features to do with size and shape of the atoms or relations between them. And that's, I suppose, something that's missing from this story, because sometimes it does seem to be the underlying explanation is not that you have a smooth atom here, but that atoms are arranged in such and such a way. And that seems to be missing from this. But then on the atoms causing the existence of bodies side, Lucretius spells that out a bit. Also, Epicurus a bit. I mean, they say something about atoms being involved in some kind of interlocking relationship where they make a sort of rebounding systematic unity. But then again, you see, one might think that means that actually just saying the atoms explain the existence of the bodies seems not quite to be enough, because if the atoms were there but not arranged in that kind of way, you wouldn't have a compound body at all. You just have a sort of a heap, but made up of.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it just seems to me that given the account we have, for instance, in Lucretius about however sketchy of how this is supposed to go, we would expect some kind of complex explanation.
Yeah, and this seems
that crisscrosses the division we get here.
So one wonders whether, I mean, there are other, so in other passages, it's quite clear that Sextus or his source is drawing an inference rather than reporting something. I mean, here this begins with Epicurus says that, but then on the other hand, there's this very suspect use of incorporeals, because Epicurus wouldn't say that. So it could well be that this is another case in which this isn't actually a verbatim report of an Epicurean view, but it's an inference from the fact that they exist, that they allow only these things into their ontology, and maybe it sort of more or less matches what they say.
Any questions? Mariel?
Yeah, I want to ask you about the thing that you said you wouldn't talk about, which is that bit at the start of the letter to Herodotus, and the prolipsis, or whatever it is that underlies the words. Because it does seem to me that one of the other roles that lector play is that they provide a way, and it doesn't have to be just semantically, they sort of provide a way of specifying the content of impressions. They provide a way of, they provide objects that are objective and that or depending on your view, and that we can sort of consider and talk about and disagree about and so on. And I guess I want to hear more about what you think there isn't an equivalent sort of thing that's going on in that bit of the letter to Herodotus. Because I guess I naively thought that maybe they are.
Well, so I mean, if preconception, I mean, that is sort of a very sort of sensible way of spelling out the center story, right? So it would be, one could make a good case that yes, here is a case in which there is something on the Epicurean theory that plays a precisely analogous role to those Stoic lector in terms of specifying the content in a kind of objective way. Because prolepsis, although presumably sort of my prolepsis might be sort of numerically different from yours, they seem to be all the same and objective then in that sense. I mean, the reason I don't think that, so basically my reservations are twofold. So one is firstly, as I already mentioned, that what he says he's doing at the beginning of the letter of Herodotus, or the sort of the morals he's tried to draw with that, from that, is a guide to inquiry, rather than a story about semantics. So, on the other hand, it's sort of fair to infer from it. So he describes, in the letter to Herodotus, what they're described as, they're said to be the things that underlie expressions. They're said to be the things such that we need to pay attention to them, we need to grasp them in inquiry. He also says if we didn't do that, then our words would be empty. And that is quite good evidence for this type of view. There he doesn't actually say that it's a prolepsis. He says that it's toproton enoema, which is unhelpful. But some people think that maybe he hasn't introduced the word prolepsis yet, because it was an innovation. In the parallel passage from Diogenes Laertius, you do get the word prolepsis, and they are described as the things that primarily underlie words. So the difficulty I have there is, so partly is because I think it's not really about semantics, but also because I don't think that prolepsis can do that job for the Epicureans, because there aren't enough of them. You don't have prolepsis. So for this to be a kind of workable general semantic theory, you'd need to have a prolepsis corresponding to every kind of general term. And they're quite clear that you don't. For example, you don't have a prolepsis of time. Prolepsis are certain special types of conception that you get only as a result of certain special types of interaction with the external world. And there are certain types of thing with which you just can't have that type of interaction. So probably we don't have preconceptions of atoms either, for example. But nonetheless, we can talk about them, and we can think about them, and we can mean something when we do so. So that basically is just why I don't think that preconceptions can do that job.
And that's really helpful and really interesting, actually. I think it sort of goes in the direction of in the direction that you're going here, which is to say they recognize that there might be a sort of kind of need in the vicinity of what the Stoics have in mind, but the Stoics, like, there's a philosophical disagreement there.
Yeah.
But the Stoics are wrong to think that you need such an expansive, exhaustive kind of entity. All you need is a few prolepses, and that's going to sort of do the job that you need it to do.
So the view on this, to which I'm most sympathetic, is what's argued by Jonathan Barnes, which is that that basically, if you just want to tell a story about meaning, then the word horse just means horses. Don't say anything about prolepsis. But prolepsis have a role in explaining speaker's meaning. That I find promising.
Simon?
Oh, thanks, Alex. We've talked about this before. So, in 2019, for example, perception is non-directional. Or it's been moved by itself, people are adding or subtracting anything.
Right.
And so that seems to imply that one of the reasons that its perception is non-rational is that it's incapable of adding or subtracting. That suggests that maybe rational states are capable of adding and subtracting, because otherwise, why would that be the reason why you say that it's non-rational? But then, so it looks like there's some sort of composition, or there's adding and subtracting. There's some sort of manipulation going on in the rational case. And it looks like, so some of the texts we were talking about earlier, especially in Sose's talk, that, that sort of compositional aspect seems pretty clearly associated in one way or another with the Stoic theory of lekton. Like, they themselves are composed, and at the psychological level, we compose various items when we form a rational state on the Stoic view. So I guess my point is, it looks like there's a rough correlation between rationality and composition on both views. And so why shouldn't so I guess coming from the Stoic view, it's like, why don't you talk about sayables if you think that rationality has this connection with composition? And moreover, sort of like what Marion was saying, we need to talk about contents somehow, because we need to say that beliefs can be true or false.
Yeah.
And then, there's also, right? So that seems to be my thoughts.
But sort of note also, of course, that they happily talk of perceptions as true or false. Whereas the Stoics, of course the Stoics will too, but whereas the Stoics won't talk of non-rational impressions as true or false, the Epicureans do talk of them as true or false. And they say that perception, a non-rational state, is true because it tells the truth, ad erthuane, because it grasps that which is just as it is by nature. I mean, that to me seems like a clear description of representation. So in a sense, but of course, I think so yeah, I see exactly your line of thought. And I think it's quite promising. Where I would disagree, though, so I think exactly you're right, so that if we went this way, then it would seem that the Stoics might well have a point. Well, or rather, there might well be something that should play the corresponding role to the Stoic lectron on the Epicurean theory, something about combination. So where in a sense, where I disagree is I don't think that I agree adding or subtracting, and in T14 you get the third option as well. So I'm going to, in T14 it's changing, the third option. Subtracting, adding, changing. My view is that is of course manipulation, but it's not a distinction between combination and non-combination. It's rather just altering. You've got the same type of content there, and it's altering it in certain ways. And you could alter it by adding some information, or subtracting some information, or just in some other way changing it. But it's that kind of. It's not changing it from a sort of composite, from a non-composite thing to a composite thing. It's just, it's like and the kind of example I have in mind is that, for example, when there's a case in which they discuss Orestes seeing the Furies, and they say, well, he saw truly because the Furies were really there, but he judged falsely because he thought they were solid. So that, I'm inclined to think, is just a case of the type of addition, right? That's adding, they're solid. But in a sense, they're both representational states. It's not that they're differing and that one is composite and the other not. It's just one has an extra bit to it, an extra bit of incorrect information that the rational mind has introduced.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess for subtracting, though. So if all perceptions are true, why would subtracting introduce falsehood? Because wouldn't you just be getting, So for that, I'm inclined to, so there's Lucretius's description. So there's one particular, of course, the Epicureans often get the objections. People say, well, it's not the case that all perceptions are true. And one standard case is the tower case. So there's a tower which is in the distance. It's, as a matter of fact, square, but supposedly it looks round because it's in the distance. I say supposedly because I have never had that impression myself. Lucretius's account of that case, he says that it doesn't actually. So what goes wrong there is you arrive at the view somehow. You think that it's a round tower in the distance. It's not, in fact, it's square. He says that it doesn't actually look exactly like a round tower. It just resembles it in a kind of shadowy way. So my view is that that's basically a case of subtraction. So in a sense, if you really attended closely to the details of your perception, you would notice various details which would make it clear that you're not having an impression of a round tower. And subtraction is ignoring those details. Like subtracting the clarity.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alex. I just want to respond to the brief remark made about ideon and cause as being translated as such in this context, but not matching what contemporary philosophers would think about this. So I would be inclined to think it's that explanation. But I was wondering why you took that. It's a long story, I know, but could you just hint at why?
Well, I mean, it depends a bit exactly what one means by. So, in a sense, if one thinks of causation, the trouble is I don't know well enough a great range of what contemporary philosophers say about causation. I mean, I'm thinking that it has something in common with, say, grounding.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like the Bennett book, Making Things Up,
Right.
2017. It might be the kind of sense of possession you want here.
Okay, so she does talk about
grounding. So that's what you want.
that's
Wide explanation.
Yeah.
So see, maybe that'd be.
But you see, my basic resistance is it doesn't really seem that we're dealing with, say, we're not dealing with things separated in time.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think she is going to give you that. I mean, it's not quite an explanation. She thinks there is like grounding and constitution and possession are one thing.
Right.
We bundle up together, and I think that's kind of modern view of possession that much what we want.
I have one question. So, let me try to understand the point about in the field of causation. Your argument is that the students have a meaningful analysis of causation of bodies and molecular properties.
Mhm.
And the Epicureans will have two bodies or two attributes of bodies.
Yeah.
Right, but then so in the case of the Stoics, what they so what one way of reading their idea of the three elements involved in relation is this: is that a knife is a cause for flesh of being cut,
Mhm.
where the effect is not the incorporeal itself, but is the incorporeal for the flesh.
Mhm.
No? And this might mean that the effect is in fact that the flesh is cut. No? And that I mean, the flesh is being cut. So if you look at this idea in this way, then I wonder how different would be the Epicurean analysis of, I mean, how would they explain, how would they describe the causation by the knife of the flesh being cut? How would they describe that?
Yeah, I don't know. The trouble is, in part, because I mean, we have so little detail of the account here. I mean, so you see, one question one might. Sorry. I mean, you see, if we were to go with the view that they are really committed to the view that it's always a body as a cause of a body and an incorporeal attribute as a cause of an incorporeal attribute, and this doesn't just cover cases of elements and compounds, but it also covers other cases, then I suppose you could say something like the sharpness of the knife, which is an attribute of the knife, is a cause of the yeah, something like that, which would also be an accident of the flesh. And in a sense, they wouldn't, and I suspect they would say that you don't need to add something like for the body, because presumably that I suspect their accidents are something like tropes, or in particular, they're individuated by that body. So it's just this particular being cut, this particular wound, rather,
Right.
belongs on this particular.
And what would be a case of a body causing a body? Is that generation and destruction? When a body causes another body to exist, and it's not analyzable in terms of a change of attribute, but rather as a body that comes into existence.
Well, I'm thinking it's not. Perhaps, but I was thinking in that case, it's much easier to think of not really sort of generation, not really change over time, but just the existence of this higher order thing being dependent on the existence of its parts. But perhaps, yeah.
And in the case of truth and falsity, you would, I mean, is your argument that the Epicureans argue that what is true or false is in fact the state of affairs or in the world?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an ontological conception of truth, which is the term they use. Whereas in Stoicism, they have a correspondence of truth according to which what is true or false is not the thing itself in the world, but something that is true or false, depending on whether something in the world happens or not. And so this, but that's not the good word for it, exactly.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I suppose, then on the Epicurean view, there would be a further story to be told about why the state of affairs type thing counts as true or false. And that would make reference to the items involved. Yeah.
Yes. And these items,
so it's not just that it's a brute fact. Yeah, indeed. So it's not just a brute fact that, say, the paper is white, or the white paper is an obtaining state of affairs. That's to be explained by reference to the paper and white.
So it is a correspondence.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans?
Well, so as I say, so one difference. So formally the difference is that they're different types of thing that are bearing truth values.
Well, yes, that's one is incorporeal and the other is.
Well, it's kind of neither corporeal nor incorporeal. It's an accident of bodies, yeah. And you actually see Epicureans just struggling a bit with how to say, how do you pick the relevant body of which this thing counts as an accident? So when Lucretius discusses the case of kidnapped Helen, I mean, the obvious difficulty is that Helen is no longer around. So normally you would say maybe state of affairs kidnapped Helen, or the existence of kidnapped Helen depends on Helen, but she's not there anymore, sadly. But kidnapped Helen somehow is still there, because it's still true to say that Helen was kidnapped. So he goes for the view, which seems a bit desperate, you might think, that it's, well, not that desperate. Can be defended. He goes for the view that it's an accident of the world in general, or perhaps of the region where the kidnapping took place. So that's one difference, I think, which is that it's quite clear that there needs to be some kind of dependence going on in the Epicurean view, that these states of affairs have to depend for their existence on something else. Of course, whether or not that's true of Stoic axiomator is a matter of debate.
Yes,
but it might not be true. And then the other big difference I already mentioned was that it's clear that you have the Stoic axiomator there even when they're false. Whereas the Epicurean view seems less sophisticated. And I'm not really sure there seems to be a gap in the story about what you say about how to explain implicit falsehood or falsehood.
Any more questions? Yes.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I have two little questions from first, it's something related to the project's neither move by itself, in 2019. In the context of making a distinction between perception and rationality, or the activity of both, it reminded me of something, so I wanted to ask how it would be different in this case. Because it reminded me of this Aristotelian distinction in perception and thinking in general, that perception cannot actualize itself while the intellectual faculty can work all on its own. Mm-hmm. But one of the conditions that rationality fulfills in order to do that, and that perception cannot, is that the object that actualizes perception is external, and on the other hand, the objects of thought are in some way already in the soul.
Right.
So nous can actualize or enter into activity without being affected upon by something external or by something different. My question in that case is, why is it that the rational impression in this case could move itself? Because it seems like, well, in rationality this happens, and in perception it does not. Why, in this case, it could be done in rationality, the self-movement or
See, I'm not actually sure that he does. I mean, so actually there's a disjunct. Well, so what he denies here, right? He says it's neither moved by itself nor when moved by something else is it capable of adding or subtracting anything. So that means he must, by implication, think that in the case of rationality, at least one of those applies. So the opposite. And I actually wonder whether he would really, so it depends on what exactly one means by is moved by itself. But when you look at the story of thought, he's actually quite clear that it is external stuff affecting the mind that causes any kind of, that is required for, I mean, not causes, but is required for any type of thinking. So in both cases, unlike in the Aristotelian case, where you have the distinction between the stuff that's in the soul and the external stuff, it's on the Epicurean case, it's in both cases, you have something external affecting you. And I mean, Lucretius at one point actually says that he's describing intentional decisions. So if you want to decide to walk somewhere, but you couldn't do this, he said, unless images of walking hit your mind from outside. So you could imprison someone by giving them a shield. So they would be unable to move if you managed to block all external images. So I do actually wonder whether he would say that it really can move itself. When he actually talks about what it does and how it is in a sense free, he says that it's things like, well, it can choose which images to focus on, or it, something like that. So it seems as if being affected by something, you can then decide what, you can then respond in different ways to it. But still, it might be the case that on the rational side, it's still a case of being affected by something external that's required. But I'm not sure.
That helps a lot. And the other thing, very short, the second condition, the capable of adding or subtracting anything. I'm not sure whether I fully understood what the explanation for either adding or subtracting was, but my question is much simpler. Is couldn't it be just a reference to the predication, like adding a predicate and subtracting a predicate, simply with whichever content perception gives me?
Yeah, they could, and some people, quite a lot of people take it that way, and Simon takes it that way, for example. I think it could indeed be taken like that. I'm not inclined to take it like that, in part because, well, I mean, in particular, if one draws from that the moral that thoughts have a predicative structure that represent the world in a certain way and perception doesn't, then I find it very hard to explain what Epicurus says about the truth of perception. And in particular, back in T14, so the other version of this, he seems to explain the truthfulness aletheoin of perception by saying, both in all cases it tells the truth and grasps that which is just as that very thing is by its nature. So I'm inclined to read that as basically ascribing some kind of predicational structure already to perception, although it's going to be quite difficult to say exactly what that structure consists in. And certainly one doesn't want to say that it involves concepts in any loaded sense, because, for example, he says that perception is not receptive of memory, and memory, and his view, concepts are associated with memory.
Thanks very much.
Sí, ya vi. Ah, ya lo vi. En la anterior fueron 34, no sé si se me acumularon esos, pero esas son las que hicimos. Sí.